Hello, everyone. My name is Wesley Livesey from the History of the Second World War podcast. Join me on a journey through the most destructive conflict in human history, a journey that will take us not just through the famous campaigns and cataclysmic battles, but also to the lesser well-known corners of the war that touched millions all over the world, as we try and answer not just the questions of what and where, but how and why. You can find History of the Second World War on all major podcast platforms or at historyofthesecondworldwar.com.
Welcome to another episode of Bro History. It's Henry Zamota, Danny Abdel-Jabbar. How's it going, Danny?
Doing great, man. How about yourself?
I'm doing pretty well. I appreciate you asking. And today, everyone's been asking for us to get some more guests. So we have a guest, and we have on today's show we have Pratik Chougule. Pratik Chougule.
Jesus.
Sorry about that. Pratik Chougule, who's a researcher and political consultant. He's currently writing a book about American universities in the Middle East and their relation to U.S. foreign policy. And you can find his work on publications such as National Interest, which we quote often, and the American Conservative. Pratik, how are you? I'm sorry about that. I've had a long day, and I'm not primed. I'll make you feel better. I mispronounced Danny's name for about
6 months.
6 to 7 months, and I've known Danny for about 5 years.
No, not a problem. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for joining us today. And you wrote a really interesting piece, and I kind of saw myself in a lot of what you wrote because one of the pieces that you wrote was your journey from being a self-proclaimed neoconservative into a foreign policy realist. And that's kind of similar to where, I have been in my life. When I was younger, I was I was a staunch Bush supporter. I was a very big supporter of the Iraq War. And, as I got into my 20s, I started to change a lot of my views. And I actually consider myself more as a non-interventionist. And the term realist, I feel like, is thrown around a lot. And I'd love to hear, your journey from, being a self-proclaimed neoconservative to a realist, and I guess give, what your definition is of a foreign policy realist.
Sure. Well, I think if there's a common denominator in my worldview that continues to the present day, it's a interest in political tyranny, and then specifically an interest in how to eradicate political tyranny. So that's what ultimately got me into neoconservatism. Now, I think I was born in 1986, and so growing up through the 90s and watching U.S. military interventions generally succeeding in stopping humanitarian crises or generally preserving a favorable world order, I think, like many people of that generation, had a great deal of confidence in the military instrument to advance human rights and democracy and so forth. Mm-hmm. But over time, a combination of watching recent U.S. military interventions occur, also becoming more educated about alternatives to military action, which I talk about in the article, and then also thinking more about the effect at home on our culture and our economy, and just generally the opportunity costs of using military force, all of which sort of made me steer away from neoconservatism and move in a more libertarian direction.
So was there so for me, I got aligned with a lot more, hawkish foreign policy during the Iraq War. And, a big thing was that was September 11th, which affected me. Danny and I are both from New York, and, I was very young when September 11th happened. So it had a very profound effect on my psychology, really. I was in 7th grade during September 11th. And that was really the big thing that kind of pushed me into, I was a young kid, so it's hard to develop any type of nuanced view on foreign policy when you're 12. However, that stuck with me for the years to come, throughout my teenage years at least, until I got into college. I started to reevaluate how I thought. Now, I'm curious to hear, what was the big. Where did you get this interest in foreign policy? Like, where did that journey start? What political event set that off for you?
So if you can believe it, it was actually when I was very young, at age 5, during the first Gulf War. And the reason why that was formative is because the first Gulf War was really the first conflict that was televised in the way that we think about it, where CNN had embedded reporters and they were following the campaign as it unfolded. And so my parents were glued to the TV like a lot of Americans were. And so that intrigued me, and my uncle, who now works in the foreign policy field, he wrote a children's book at the time to try to explain the war to kids like me and others who were watching it unfold. He, in the children's book, he basically portrayed the conflict as if a bully named Iraq was stealing blocks from a child named Kuwait, and that America sort of intervened to stop this. So
that's don't steal my blocks, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You got to tell me where I can get a copy of this, because I tried to get it on Amazon and it wasn't available.
Oh, okay, yeah, no, I have a whole box of them. I'll get you a copy.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks.
Yeah. Anyway, but so that piqued my interest in foreign policy, and even as I developed a more mature understanding of the conflict, I came to really regret the way the war ended. I thought, and even now, I think that had we managed the 91 uprising in the right way, we may have prevented a lot of problems that ended up occurring down the line. And then when you think about from 91 forward, the U.S. military and U.S. interventions, I think, were broadly successful in terms of how we addressed the crises in the Balkans, how we, on economics, promoted globalization and free trade. And then after 9/11, I thought, in light of the experience over the last couple of decades, that we really had a moment and an opportunity to bring democracy and human rights to the Middle East, all of which I thought would ultimately redound not only to our own national security interests, but also to the benefit of the people in the region. But obviously, things did not turn out in that way.
Not exactly, no. But that's a very pragmatic, approach to it, and I think, a lot of Americans kind of fell for that trap. And it seems like, looking in hindsight, it kind of was a trap, based on the pretenses. But you talk a lot about how perhaps it didn't pan out the way that it should have, post 9/11. And I was reading one of your articles on how you transitioned from a neoconservative to a foreign policy realist. And I just wanted to read a quick quote from that and maybe get some additional color for that. So you wrote, realism is not simply a concession to the world as it is, where religious and ethnic identities retain their stubborn holds, and where human nature resents even the most benevolent efforts to impose societal transformation. In realist insights, I discern the roots of a sustainable strategy, one that could preserve the enlightened ideals of Western civilization, at least as long as it remained mindful of America's historic role as a global stabilizer, as well as the universalistic ethos that often animates its people. Satisfied that realism had compelling moral basis, I concluded that a foreign policy of restraint offers the best hope for nurturing democratic capitalism at home and inspiring those in other countries who, as Irving Kristol counseled, will draw on their own political and cultural backgrounds in arriving at a sustainable disposition of this matter. So I was wondering, could you explain what a foreign policy of restraint is, and how does that differ from isolationism, for example?
Well, I think the way the word isolationism is used in our current political discourse, it's often used as an insult, in a way of sort of pigeonholing people into certain beliefs. And so I try to avoid that term. But to me, even if you're using it not in a value-laden way, it kind of implies or connotes to me someone who broadly wants to live in a fortress America where they want to keep America as a cocoon away from the world. And that's at least emphatically not where I am. I very much would like to see an America that's engaged in the world, certainly participating in free trade, but also in the exchange of ideas and people. So I'm certainly not an isolationist. I think part of the reason I gravitated toward neoconservatism at the outset was actually in many ways because I found realism, at least in the way that I understood it at the time, to be unsatisfying, and unsatisfying for two reasons. I think one, as we talked about, I noticed that a lot of realists had a very pessimistic view of what America could achieve in the world, which struck me as being overly pessimistic in light of how enormous the power imbalance was between the U.S. and the rest of the world. Mm-hmm. But the other was that I found that many realists, at least struck me as being agnostic or indifferent to the role of values. And I thought that this was a strategic misjudgment for two reasons. One, because I think we do, in fact, have something to offer to the world in terms of our values. But two, a big part of our identity as a Enlightenment nation is very much grounded in values. And if this country were to, or its leaders were to try to conduct a foreign policy that did not pay attention to our universal ideals, our liberal democracy, our emphasis on human rights, that I think too much of a gap would emerge between the culture and sentiments of the American people and their leaders. But as I wrote in that section that you quoted, I think looking back, that was an unfair characterization of realism, and I think realism, at least in the way that I understood it, or I understand it now, can sort of lead to a foreign policy that cares about human rights, cares about democracy, but does so with the prudence and caution that we need in light of just realities in the world.
So I was at this thing I was in a fellowship for the National Review, and you can imagine that it was like a National Review Fellowship Institute. I wasn't actually like a writer or was employed by the National Review, but I was like part of a program that they were running. And basically, it was the way I describe it in a nutshell. It was a group of New York City conservatives talking about their feelings and how hard it is to be conservative in New York City. But other than that, there was actually a lot of interesting lectures that they would have. And during our foreign policy lecture, the way that they described it was that, there's four types of people when it comes to foreign policy. There's a strict non-interventionist. There is a neoconservative. So people like, non-interventionists, they would consider someone like Pat Buchanan or Ron Paul. Like, those are the people they drew underneath that. Then when it came to neoconservatives, they drew up people, from the Bush administration, like Dick Cheney and, Richard Pearl, guys like that. And then they drew up, for war hawks, they made a distinction between war hawks and neoconservatives, and they iconed John Bolton as a war hawk. I frankly don't really know the difference between a neoconservative and a war hawk. I guess if you're referring to a neoconservative as that specific clique that was in the Bush office, maybe I could see your point. Or maybe someone who just really believes in like the idea of spreading democracy across the world, and that ideology of leading in front and inspiring people by force. But the way they defined Warhawk was more so just someone who doesn't play around, who enforces, who's very concerned about security and doesn't take any threats, lightly. But then when it came to realist, the guy who was performing the lecture, the realist, they said someone who's just very pragmatic. They pick and choose their battles. They're someone who doesn't jump into needless conflict, but is not afraid to use force when the time is right or when they have to. So I was wondering what you thought of those definitions, and I'd love to hear what your insight would be to that. If you have anything to add, or if you disagree with anything.
Well, that sounds broadly correct to me. I think that where I would draw a difference perhaps between a war hawk, as you said, and a neoconservative is that I think neoconservatives care very deeply about human rights and democracies and values. It isn't simply a talking point or something. And I think that those differences perhaps show up when we're in the realm of strictly humanitarian endeavors. I suspect, I don't know about John Bolton per se, but people in that mold of conservatism, I think, would have serious reservations about intervening in a humanitarian conflict or crises where everyone agrees that we have no direct or ostensible national interest, whereas I think for a neoconservative, they perhaps would be more in tune with a liberal internationalist, someone like Samantha Power, where they recognize that there is a compelling reason to act morally, if nothing else. I do also find it interesting that as you said, the discussion kind of lumped someone like Pat Buchanan and Ron Paul in the same category. I think given the moment we're in and given where our political debates are, I suppose people of those viewpoints perhaps find themselves in agreement in opposition to much of the status quo. But I would think that at a philosophical level, there is actually quite a bit of a difference between someone whose starting premise is that sort of America as a political unit or as a nation state really is paramount versus a libertarian who perhaps ultimately would like to see a truly interconnected world without borders and free trade and that sort of thing. So, they might come down on the same side of any debate about military force, but it seems to me like the end goal here is actually radically different.
How does, just kind of playing along with that, how do you think foreign policy of restraint or realism offers kind of the best hope for nurturing those democratic capitalism at home and abroad?
I think my views actually, since I wrote that article, have evolved a little bit in the sense that I think most people who describe themselves as realists very much believe not only as a practical matter, but also as a moral matter. They're very much comfortable with a world order based on coherent nation states and countries pursuing their national interest. And at the time that I wrote that article, I broadly took for granted that U.S. foreign policy ought to really be concerned first and foremost with the American national interest, that there wasn't anything wrong with it, and that for the foreseeable future, we would really have an America-centric world order that we should tend to. I think since I wrote that article, I've become more open-minded really about moving on to a new type of world order where nation states really begin to dissolve or at least weaken as political entities, and where we see much more globalization and integration, and where we begin to see free trade becoming a reality, where we begin to see nation states perhaps fracture with secessionist movements, where we see free trade, free economic zones increasingly becoming free political zones as well. So I think I'm moving much more in that direction, which probably puts me at odds a little bit with realists.
Okay, that sounds to me very much like more libertarian values than anything else. Would you consider yourself a libertarian?
Yeah, I'm certainly moving in that direction. I think that probably a major realization that I've had over the last few years is simply that there are real limits as to what government can achieve. I very much, I don't know if you recall this, but at some point in his administration, I don't remember the exact year, we can probably look it up, but Obama gave a long interview to Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic. This was after the Libya intervention. And in fact, this may even have been where he popularized the term the blob to describe the foreign policy establishment. Mm-hmm. But if I remember the interview correctly, he basically said, look, I deferred to these foreign policy experts on Libya. We intervened, and now look at what happened. And that really struck a chord to me, because when I spent a lot of time looking at the Iraq War, the conception and execution of it, and because it was so obviously mismanaged in so many ways, I held on for a long time to the belief that if only we had gotten certain things right, that the war could have turned out differently.
Right.
But when you look at the execution of the operation in Libya, it's pretty hard to find a circumstance where military intervention happens as cleanly as that. I mean, we had the whole world united behind us. We had an indigenous uprising. We had a small country with natural resources right near the European continent. I mean, you had like all the conditions that very rarely align in the real world. You also, I would even argue, had a fairly competent team in the Obama administration, and yet I don't think there's a single person today who argues that Libya today is a better, safer place than what it was before, and it has caused a lot of problems for the U.S. ability to act down the line. And so it just sort of occurred to me that if military intervention in our government cannot manage even a crisis on that scale, we're not really dealing with a implementation or execution problem. We really have to fundamentally rethink this emphasis or dependence that we have on the military instrument.
And that's a really interesting point that you bring up, that all the stars were aligned for a successful intervention in Libya. But meanwhile, after the intervention, after you get rid of Gaddafi, there's Al-Qaeda cells everywhere in Libya, and you have things like, open air slavery. You have a huge migrant crisis going into Europe. I mean, that was, from my understanding, that was already taking place, but it certainly did not help to have Gaddafi removed from power. And it's a really interesting point that even when all the stars are aligned correctly and you think that's an ideal time to, pounce and go through an intervention, it still doesn't work out at the end of the day.
Right.
So I'm curious. So going to, the other article that you wrote, so the pacifist movement is dead, or, peace is past, why the pacifist movement died. So
Passé, by the way, Henry.
What's that?
You pronounce it passé.
Passé? Oh, well.
Sorry.
Peace is passé, why the pacifist movement died. So I would love to hear, I guess, your diagnosis of what happened to the pacifist movement, because in your article you actually really go through the history from World War I to now. So I hope I know I may be asking you a kind of a long task, but I'd love to. Would you mind outlining the history of of the American pacifist movement and what exactly happened to it?
Yeah, I mean, the genesis of this article really was that I was watching the Democratic candidates debate foreign policy, and there is now a genuine debate in the Democratic Party on foreign policy, and you can see the different worldviews. But one of the things that struck me was that many of the Democratic candidates differed on this or that military intervention or whatever. But I found that even the candidates like Tulsi Gabbard and others who are really fundamentally questioning our foreign policy, it seems to me like none of them were really questioning the use of military power, not only as a matter of pragmatism, but really morally, thinking about whether a foreign policy grounded in this military instrument and with frequent use of force is inherently morally acceptable. And so I began to then think about, well, why is that? How did we get there? Now, before I wrote this article, when I heard the term pacifism, my mind automatically would go in one of two directions. Either I thought about like the American Quaker movement, for example, or I thought of the Gandhian tradition sort of elsewhere in the world. But as I began to do the research for this article, I was quite surprised at how prominent the pacifist movement has been throughout the 20th century, how, although I argue it was never by any means a majority or dominant worldview, it was absolutely part of the national debate and the national discourse. And it was like that because pacifism enjoyed a great deal of buy-in, not only from grassroots movements, but also by some of the most powerful, influential elites in our society. And I talk in the article about how, beginning from World War I through the Vietnam War, pacifism had a great deal of an impact on our national discourse. But then after hitting a high point in the Vietnam War, it basically faded away and now is basically a non-factor in our foreign policy debates.
So what do you think happened? So here's something, and I'm going to throw this at you. So looking back at the Iraq War, when there was all these large protests from the left, from the American left towards the Bush administration. But meanwhile, you see later, there's still intervention taking place. The Obama administration is hawkish on Libya, as we discussed, and, they're hawkish on Syria as well. So it can leave someone to come with the diagnosis that the left, the American left, was never really anti-war or non-interventionist. They were just anti-Bush. They were anti-Republican, and that's why they protested the war. And I think it's fair to say, not everyone, of course, but I think it's fair to say that maybe if it was a Democrat in office, that they would have been a lot more content with the Iraq War and, Afghanistan and Iraq and everything that happened after 9/11. So love to hear, what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, I remember, I guess you raise a good point, because when you look at the run-up to the Iraq War, there were, in fact, mass anti-war protests both here and in Europe, but they never, for a variety of reasons, translated into any sort of real initiative or reflection among the American Congress. Now, I remember at the time, in the run-up to the Iraq War, when prominent Democrats would get behind the war, I always thought that maybe there was a degree of cynicism. Maybe they just didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of an American military intervention, as many on the left were after the first Gulf War. But I think in retrospect, as we look back at it, when you look at the vote in Congress to authorize the use of force in Iraq, it was overwhelming. It was a genuine bipartisan endorsement of war. And I think actually there's reason to believe that this was not simply a cynical vote by the Democratic Party, that it actually did reflect broadly where at least the elites of the Democratic Party are. And I would argue that for a couple of reasons. I think one point to think about is that if you look at the 2000 election, you have to consider the fact that Gore got more votes than Bush did. And if you look at the platform that he ran on, he was actually arguing, I would argue, for a not only an even more aggressive foreign policy, but also one backed by, if I recall correctly, he was actually campaigning on expanding the defense budget even more than the Bush administration was. And so I think there's real reason to believe that had 9/11 happened on the watch of a Gore-Lieberman administration, we may very well have gotten the same outcome. But even after, when you look at 2004, 2008, when you look at how the Democratic primaries evolved, it took until 2008, first of all, for a significant portion of the Democratic Party to gravitate toward a candidate in Obama who seemed to even somewhat question the prevailing orthodoxy of foreign policy. But even Obama was always very clear that although he had opposed the Iraq War, it was not because he had any principled objection to the use of military force or even to this idea of American global leadership. He simply objected to the, quote, dumb war. And so Obama very much consolidated support for this kind of foreign policy that we had under Bush and under Clinton and under George H.W. Bush. And there was a much greater degree of continuity under Obama than there was any difference from what we had before.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I'd like to color this a little bit. So Pratik, I'm not sure that you know this, but Henry happens to fall on the kind of the right side of politics, where I kind of fall on the left. And some of the beauty of our show is that oftentimes we disagree, and this is one point where I'd like to disagree with Henry on the characterization that the anti-war sentiment from the left during the Iraq War was just simply an anti-Bush movement. Now, admittedly,
I don't think that's entirely true. I think that there's some elements of it. I think that. Go on and make your point, and then I'll respond to it.
Cool. I think obviously we're all the three of us were all pretty young at the time that this war kicked off. So I'm not super in the know about the motivations of the broad American people for whether or not they had any true pacifist inclinations in opposition to the war. that's something that I think someone else with much more research on the topic would have to kind of discuss. But one thing that we have been talking about is kind of the political elite class. The folks in the House and the Senate, our leaders, Al Gore, and to a certain extent at this point, we also touched on Obama. But if I read your article correctly, part of the pacifist movement is grassroots, like a big part of it. And it's more than just the elites. It's also, like a broad spectrum of people that are getting behind these causes. Now, obviously, to your point, big leaders in parties and politics and people with influence and sway were on board with these pacifist movements as well, so that definitely helped it. But I question the characterization that this was strictly an anti-Bush movement, and this is especially true for someone like myself who, after the war was initiated, I was much too young to form, like a good opinion about it. At the time, I trusted the characterization that, Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and therefore, that was grounds enough to act and to intervene. Nevertheless, when we come to find out in the years following that, in fact, there's not that much substance to those claims, it really became clear to me that that this intervention was wrong.
Welcome to the future in this year's wildest super fun show for adults.
Hey gang, it's Josh Olson.
And Joe Dante.
And we want to tell you about our podcast. It's about movies.
Josh, there are 1,000 podcasts about movies.
Sure, but ours is different, Joe.
That's true, actually. Our guests are writers, directors, musicians, comedians, actors.
Hell, we even have other podcasters on.
We play no favorites, and they don't talk so much about their own work, but about the movies that have influenced them and made them who they are. We call it The Movies That Made Me.
We've talked with people like Guillermo del Toro, Little Stevie Van Zandt, Martin Short, Ethan Hawke, William Friedkin, Barbara Crampton, Jonathan Ross, Dennis Lehane, Mark Duplass, Adam McKay, Lorraine Newman, Jason Reitman, Allison Anders, Elijah Wood, Stephen Canals, Eli Roth, Joe Bob Briggs, Roger Corman, Bobcat Goldthwait, Leon Douglas, Dana Gould, Martin Campbell, Shane Black, Albert Hughes, Emily Deschanel, Joe Biafra, Larry Fessenden, Nicole Hausen, Shaka King, Lee Daniels, Rosalind Chow, Clancy Brown, Harvey Smith, Ike Barinholtz, Steve Arquette, Thomas Middleton, Jim Prince, and Uwe Boll.
It may not be highbrow, but it's lots of fun.
Subscribe for free on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get podcasts.
In color to thrill you as never before.
If you enjoy bizarre true stories, then the Useless Information Podcast is the podcast for you. For example, did you know that author Robert Louis Stevenson gave his birthday away? Or that there was a football team that played for 6 years before someone realized that the school never ever existed? Or that a dog in upstate New York was once placed on trial for murder? Well, to hear these and hundreds of additional fascinating true stories from the flip side history, be sure to check out the Useless Information Podcast. That's the Useless Information Podcast, podcasting worldwide since 2008 and available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. Be sure to check it out.
And that I was genuinely opposed to it, both on the grounds that I found it immoral, I found it, crazy, all the people that, that were dying on both sides, but frankly, the majority of the Iraqi and Afghani citizens that, were being absolutely demolished. But also on a, from a pragmatic, practical response, right? It's extremely expensive, that my trust in the political system was waning. And, I wonder, you talk about this pacifist movement, and I wonder if maybe you're missing out on that color. Do you think that truly peace and pacifism as a is passé? Do you believe that there weren't elements of pacifism here in the United States during those conflicts, or till today for that matter?
Well, it's a good question. I guess I'd be curious if you agree or if you think I'm reading this correctly. But as I went back and did the research, one of the things that struck me was that every time the U.S. mobilized toward war, there would be a domestic debate on the war. The U.S. would get in. And then when the conflict turned out to be costlier than people thought, or for whatever reason people came to regret the decision to get in, as part of the backlash or the questioning of the conflict, you had all sorts of people coming to question it. But among that debate, you would have a significant contingent of people who were espousing explicitly pacifist views. So I mentioned in the article after World War I, you had thousands of people joining pacifist groups, and they made enough of an impact that Jane Addams won a Nobel Peace Prize. World War II, which we now think about as being this decisive Allied victory, one that was strategically and morally justified. Even at that time, you had a backlash from conscientious objectors who identified and organized as radical pacifists. And again, due to their relief efforts and whatnot, won a Nobel Peace Prize. Korean War, again, you had a grassroots and elite movement of people who were espousing pacifist views. And then, of course, all of this peaks in Vietnam. Now, the question that I struggled with, and I still don't have exactly a clear answer, is that in both now Afghanistan and Iraq, you had a military intervention with broad-based support that, by any reasonable standard, proved to be far costlier than what I think anyone had in mind when we went in. And you've certainly now, I think, we've now reached a national consensus where I think most people recognize that the Iraq war was probably not the right decision, and now there are serious questions even about Afghanistan. And yet that insight and that recognition that we haven't achieved what we wanted to in Iraq, we haven't seen the blowback to it really expound on pacifist views in the way that we have had after past military interventions that didn't go the right way.
And hold on one moment. So let's just take a quick moment to talk about sex, good sex. Now you can increase your performance and get that extra confidence in bed. Listen up, BlueChew.com. That's blue like the color blue. Blue Chew brings you the first chewable with the same FDA-approved active ingredients as Viagra and Cialis, so you know they work. You take them anytime, day or night, even on a full stomach, and since they're chewable, they work up to twice as fast as a pill, so you can be ready whenever that opportunity arises. Now, if you could benefit from extra function and more confidence where it counts, Blue Chew is the fast and easy way to enhance your performance. Most guys talk a good game, but Blue Chew helps you follow through. Blue Chew is prescribed online and shipped straight to your door in a discreet package, so no in-person doctor visits and no waiting on the pharmacy. And best of all, no more awkwardness. Right now, we got a special deal for our listeners. Visit BlueChew.com and get your first shipment free when you use our special promo code BRO. That's B-R-O. Just pay $5 shipping. Again, that's B-L-U-E Chew.com, promo code BRO to try free. Blue Chew is the better, cheaper, faster choice, and we thank them for sponsoring this podcast. And oh yeah, they're also made in the USA, and they're cheaper than a pharmacy, so don't forget it. Thank you, Blue Chew.
Thanks, Blue Chew.
Sorry about that. So I guess I would love to just kind of get where your synopsis real quick, and just to follow up on what you were saying before, where do you think, what do you think happened to the pacifist movement in the U.S.? Do you think it ever, it ever really existed at all, or was it something that could have been just a response to domestic politics or just certain events?
Well, I think in many ways the decline of the pacifist movement is a testament to the decisions that American foreign policy leaders made after the Vietnam War, where they reoriented our defense strategy to basically prevent something like a pacifist movement from ever really coming to the fore again. So one of the things that they did, of course, was get rid of the national draft and create an all-volunteer army, which put the onus or the burden of the war on a small cross-section of Americans who are generally outside of our country's elite. The other thing they did was that as the defense budget grew, it very much became a component of the American social safety net. Mm-hmm. So a wide cross-section of Americans basically found employment either directly or indirectly in the defense industry. And importantly, many of the projects or systems that they were working on actually had really nothing to do with our ongoing military conflict. So it removed much of that moral dilemma or consideration. And then the final thing is that as I talk in some detail in the article, a big part of the reason why the pacifist movement, particularly during Vietnam, was able to gain traction is because leaders of the pacifist movement aligned with the civil rights movement and others who were agitating in American society to resist various injustices in American society, which made it easier to sort of draw the link between problems on the home front with a problematic war abroad. Whereas since the Vietnam War, even though there obviously have been various points of friction in American society, broadly speaking, domestic discontent, insofar as it exists at all, has never reached the boiling point that provided an opening for a really radical questioning of our foreign policy as well.
And that's a great point, because I think that most Americans now, Danny and I and you and most people who are following foreign policy, who are geeks about this stuff, we're definitely the minority. Most of the people I interact with on a day-to-day basis, they don't really have a strong opinion on foreign policy. Really, it's they're they don't like mindless war, but their perception on the U.S. military is usually very idolized. It's usually very glorified. And I'm not saying that the U.S. military doesn't deserve respect, because I think they do. But most people just don't have strong opinions or really care about foreign policy. No one's really cared about foreign policy since the Iraq War. And I would even say that probably the beginning stages of the Iraq War, the average American didn't really care about it, unless you can point to, another time that people really were following, U.S. escapades in places like the Middle East.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I mean, I would argue that in 2008, at least in the Democratic primary, the Obama-Hillary contest to some degree was I'll put it a different way, that had Iraq not gone as badly as it did, I think that it would have been much harder for a candidate like Obama to wage a serious challenge to Hillary Clinton. So I think the Democrats had somewhat of a debate on foreign policy. But I remember I talked to a lot of friends and colleagues who were involved with the Romney campaign in 2012, and they basically made a strategic decision not to really engage on foreign policy for the simple reason that they really had nothing fundamental to disagree with the Obama administration. And so it really kind of created a broad-based national consensus behind foreign policy. And even now, going into the 2016 campaign, as I talk about in the article, the range of difference on foreign policy within the Democratic Party is, from a historical standard, not all that significant. And my prediction here could be completely wrong, but whoever the Republican and Democratic nominees are, I would be surprised if 2020 is an election fundamentally about national security or foreign policy. I think the big questions are going to be primarily to do with domestic policy, namely the economy, and then also a variety of culture war issues.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up the economy, because I wanted to pick a little bit on something that you had mentioned. I want to get your take on what the relationship, between the decline of that pacifist military culture and the military-industrial complex is. I want to talk more about that, because that's something, topic of interest for myself, actually.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would make a couple points here. I think to the point about Americans not being interested in foreign policy, I think one of the byproducts of that is when foreign policy is not really resonating as an issue among the American people writ large, that creates an opening for elites to have an outsized role in our foreign policy decisions. And I think that one of the consequences of having a large, as you say, military-industrial complex is that many of the elites who end up having an outsized role in foreign policy come broadly from this defense-industrial complex, whether they're current or former military officials, whether they're think tank people who get funding from a variety of defense-oriented things, or just simply academics and others who decide that they want a career in foreign policy and they end up going through a series of educational experiences, internships, whatnot, all of which are with people whose views are much more hawkish and comfortable with military intervention than the American people. So I think that that's certainly one cost of the military, or not cost, but one consequence at least of the military-industrial complex. And then I would say the other one is simply that so much of our economy, so much of our domestic home front is oriented around the military and defense industry that at a certain point it becomes hard even to fathom that there could be an alternative. And I think one of the tragedies of our foreign policy today that I think we don't talk about enough is just how profoundly different our country could be if so much of our economy wasn't oriented around investing in the latest weapon system. I mean, imagine if all the intelligent people in our country were thinking about science or innovation or economics rather than defense programs. I think we'd have a totally different.
I can't agree with you more, Pratik. That's awesome. And in that respect, I'd like to talk about this hot button topic while we're talking about the military industrial complex, and that's the F-35 program. And as you point out aptly, many jobs are created from the military industrial complex, and it makes it quite difficult, to oppose, military expansion and investments in our technical capabilities. Now, I'll preface this all by saying I still think it's important for us to be able to, lead in terms of our military capability, but I'd argue that we should do so in a much more dynamic way that doesn't necessarily, cost as much as it do. And so the F-35 being the shining example of this, as you probably already know, the production of the F-35 is set up in 43 states and 9 different countries. We're talking about the most expensive military program ever. And it comes down to a point where, no senator, no House member wants to vote to kind of kill this program because they'd also be simultaneously voting to, cut jobs from their own districts and their own states. So I wanted to get your take on the F-35 program. And
Danielle, I have one more thing to that. Bernie Sanders voted for the F-35 program.
Yes, he did.
He was a supporter of the F-35.
I don't want to lose jobs. We make airplane parts. I'll do it. I'll do it right here in Vermont.
No more corporate welfare except for jobs in Vermont.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that was doubly striking about Bernie Sanders' support for the F-35, we'll have to look up the exact quote, but I think he said something to the effect that the Vermont National Guard wouldn't have enough to do in the absence of F-35 programs, which to me is an argument for getting rid of the F-35. But anyway, no, I mean, look, the F-35 has long been a poster child for cronyism and defense waste and the things you mentioned. I was both in this article and another one I did recently. One of the things I found it quite striking as I looked into the details of the F-35 that it's not only a matter of pork barrel spending or defense cronyism at home, but it has very real consequences for our foreign policy. The two areas that I delved into in my recent articles, one of them is the fact that during this period when we were really struggling with the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, the F-35, which we're pouring just millions of dollars into, did not conduct a single airstrike in Afghanistan until 2018, and then Iraq even, I think just this year, it flew a mission for the first time, and that too in a way that probably was not entirely appropriate. Tom Cotton said, raised the question, why are we using this 5th generation fighter to strike, quote, as he said, a bunch of terrorists hiding in the bushes.
Right.
But the other component of this, which I think is probably actually even more significant, is the fact that because we're producing and making these F-35s for domestic political reasons, they now have to go somewhere, and it's quite striking the extent to which the F-35 and F-35 sales are a feature of the way we conduct relations with our closest allies. Where we basically, all but bully our allies into making these purchases that they don't need. It's not good for either side, and then it creates a whole host of negative externalities for the way our allies think about their own defense.
Got to sell that product, Pratik,
Well, it's interesting because back in, I believe it was May, Japan purchased, 106 of them? I forget the exact number, but they did purchase a lot. And, we're talking about something that's, Danny, what's the unit number on an F-35? Like a $250,000?
It's been forever.
A $250 million or something like that?
It's too much. I mean, I know the helmet itself is like, $100,000 or something like that.
I think it's something around $180 million or so per unit. But, I always thought that the reason why that it's been used to balance out trade deficits with our allies. So like Japan, it seemed to me like they were striking out some type of trade balance, and that's why they were forced to purchase the F-35.
Yeah, I mean, I focused specifically on U.S.-South Korea relations, and just recently South Korea made this massive $6.8 billion F-35 sale, which is the largest in South Korean history. And again, if the consequences were only limited to buying off certain influential domestic constituencies, that would be one thing. But as I argue in the article, now, when you make a purchase like this is going to reorient your entire strategy and thinking about your own defense. And I think when the South Koreans are dealing with a serious threat and a problem like North Korea, which is, in my view, a genuine foreign policy crisis, looking at the North Korean challenge through the lens or the prism of an F-35 and its capabilities, I think is going to distort South Korean thinking in a very profound way and make it harder rather than easier to reach a good conclusion with the North Korea crisis.
Right. I mean, defensively, the biggest advantage that the North Koreans have isn't like a nuclear program, but it's their artillery units that they have stationed in the mountains just north of South Korea. And I can't imagine that a squadron of, F-35s could, do very much to that effect. I mean, some of the things that we've read and reported on, have said that, within hours they could absolutely demolish Seoul, and that's a capability that begs the question, is this the correct tool for the South Koreans? And you raise a really good point, I think, of saying that, okay, now they've invested so much money in these very high tech, fighters, but they have to use them. They can't just have them sit there and collect dust, so that's a really good point.
Yeah, and I'm curious to hear, and I know Danny wanted to, I don't want to steal your question that you had planned for him, but I did want to kind of segue into, your history working with some different administrations. Now, did you work directly with Bush? I think I saw in a bio that you were a Bush appointee.
Yeah, I was at the State Department during the final year from 2008 to 2009. I was working for the Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, who at the time was John Rood, and Rood is now actually the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy right now.
And first of all, how was working for the Bush administration? Like, I would just love to hear some feedback on that experience.
Yeah, at the time, it was quite interesting because the Undersecretary Bureau that I was working in at the State Department prior to my boss, John Rood, having that position, it was actually John Bolton who had that position before he went to the UN. And at the time, Bolton was the hawk in the State Department, and increasingly he wasn't on the same page as then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. So a lot of the big arms control issues that ordinarily would have been handled by that office had been sort of moved out of there and given to others, namely Iran and North Korea. So by the time that I was in that bureau, some of the big issues we were working on were the missile defense systems in Poland and the Czech Republic. We were also thinking about U.S.-Russia arms control issues, which took an interesting turn when the Russian invasion of Georgia happened. Mm-hmm. And then we were also thinking through, and I spent a lot of time on this, thinking through the threat of nuclear terrorism, and I spent a lot of time looking into how probable it was, where it would come from, etc. So the issues those were some of the big issues. And then it was also my first introduction to just learning about how foreign policy actually is made in government, which was its own education.
So compare now. I think you worked with Trump as well. Did you work in on the Trump campaign, or did you work in his office as well?
No, I was the policy coordinator on the campaign for a couple of months, and I ended up resigning from the campaign.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm curious about that. So I did while I was reading your posts, you linked to a LinkedIn post. I'm assuming that you wrote just after you had resigned, and if you don't mind me quoting you, under no circumstances, you write, will I support Donald Trump for president? I regret my decision last April to join the campaign as policy coordinator. Although I left the campaign in August for a variety of reasons, I wish that I had done so sooner and spoken out more forcefully against a candidate who embodies the worst excesses of our culture. I'm curious about that. Like, what happened?
Yeah. I've thought a lot about this, and I suppose it actually ties back to our earlier point about the consequences of a national security state and so forth, where it's easy to get caught up in these situations for pragmatic or opportunistic reasons, and then before you know it, you're in a situation you don't like. So prior to joining the Trump campaign, I was the policy coordinator on the Huckabee campaign.
Right.
Because Trump and Huckabee had gotten to know each other and became friendly, as Trump was moving toward securing the nomination, he had, to a remarkable degree, really, all but won the Republican nomination, essentially by himself and a small group of people. So as he realized that he needed to actually have a genuine team in place, he began to borrow from some of the other campaigns, Huckabee included. So at the time that I was invited to join the campaign, and this wasn't a position that I had pursued, unlike some of the other things I've done, a colleague of mine asked if I would join the campaign. I would say of the 16 or whatever, 17 Republican candidates who were running that year, Trump was probably my least favorite. I would even at the time I would have been happier with anyone else. But I wasn't a never Trumper. That I did think that there was some promise in his candidacy. I thought that he deserved a fair chance, given that the party was gravitating toward him. And I thought that, particularly as it dawned on him that this presidential campaign was more than a PR stunt, that he now actually would be one of the two major party nominees, that he would mature and begin to conduct himself like a prospective president. To me, there were two big turning points when I was working for Trump. The first was when I compared and contrasted the Republican and Democratic national conventions, and I saw the speech that Trump gave at the Republican convention, which I found to be quite embarrassing and alarming. I remember I called a friend of mine after Trump gave his speech, and I said, this guy sounds sounds like a Latin American tin pot dictator. That was like the feel of it. And then when you contrasted that to the way Hillary Clinton conducted herself, she's much more liberal than I am, but whatever you think of her, I thought that she was eminently qualified and up to the job and not fundamentally taking issues with our norms and whatnot. So that's when I resigned from the campaign. But when I decided to speak out against him, it was really after the Billy Bush tape. And to me, that was just, it certainly wasn't the first time Trump had crossed the line with poor behavior and whatnot. But to me, that was just like a final straw where it was clear that this guy wasn't, at least in my mind, that he wasn't morally fit for the job of the presidency.
That's super interesting.
So what's your take on the split between John Bolton and Trump? Like, what do you think? Well, first, how would you judge Trump so far with your new transition from, becoming more of a foreign policy realist? Like, how has Trump done so far?
Well, this is, I'm going to say this grudgingly, but, I think one of the realities that's hard for people like me or people who are critics of the Trump administration is that as problematic and disturbing as his personal conduct is, I think if you're looking strictly on a policy basis at the Trump administration, although they haven't accomplished all that much, I think one would have to concede that they also have avoided many of the blunders of their predecessors. I mean, say what you want about Trump, but we haven't seen on the domestic front the kind of, in my view, misguided overhaul of our healthcare the way we saw under Obama. We certainly have not had the kind of foreign policy blunders that we saw under George W. Bush. So in that sense, I think the Trump administration deserves some credit for their caution and their prudence in policy, even as Trump continues to behave in this reckless way personally. But I do think that the consequences of Trump's behavior and the way that he has transformed the Republican Party and really made populism a serious, coherent force in our politics, even if he is impeached and removed from office, there's a cost on our institutions and our political norms and our civility that is going to be very hard to undo, I think, regardless of how this turns out.
It's an interesting take, and I wonder if we can take a look specifically at some foreign policy moves that Trump has made recently, and
well,
actually
let's outline the last couple, his big staple moves that he's made. The first thing I think of is the JCPOA. He moved out of it.
Right.
He pulled out of it, and it seems like a lot of what he's dealing with now are consequences of him pulling out of the JCPOA. So. That whole debacle with Iran when Iran shot down a drone, and just basically that whole saga which continues, which is not over yet by any means, of the turmoil in the Strait of Hormuz. I'll give credit to Trump when credit's due, that he showed restraint in not pulling the trigger, and essentially starting, either a minor or major military conflict. Who knows how big the conflict would have been if he did this? I tend to think it would have been probably more serious. It would have been huge. But the fact that he didn't do it, you got to give him credit. Like, to me, I was like, all right, well, he deserves credit for not actually doing it. And then the other things that he deserves credit on, is North Korea, at least trying to make some type of bond with them. But when I give him credit, it's still kind of reluctantly, because a lot of the things that he's dealing with is the consequences of him pulling out of the JCPOA. So I'd love to hear your take on, Trump's major move of pulling out of the Iran deal. And I guess everything that's happened after that,
I want to take a moment to tell you guys about my podcast called The Team House. My name's Jack Murphy. I'm a former Ranger and Green Beret, and I've worked as a national security journalist for the last 10 years. The Team House is a natural extension of that, where I interview former spies and special operations personnel from all over the world. These are exclusive interviews from people who work in the shadows and come a little bit into the light for these exclusive interviews that we do every week, live streamed on YouTube at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And they're available as video on demand and audio on demand wherever you listen to podcasts.
What happened there, I guess?
Well, look, I would chide Trump's policy on Iran for the same reason I would criticize the Iran policy of his last couple of predecessors, which has simply been that we've had a general failure of imagination. Now, I think the biggest problem, in my view, with our Iran policy is the fact that we haven't come to terms with the fact that our problem with Iran is not a nuclear problem. It's not a terrorism problem. It's really the fact that we have in Iran an odious regime in power. We don't know the extent to which it enjoys the support of its own people, but I think that there are serious reasons to question how stable it is in light of the tumult in Iran. So I would like to see an Iran policy that recognizes that we have a strategic interest in the Iranian regime falling, but falling in a way that is nonviolent and comes from an indigenous grassroots movement. And I would say that we've had, I would criticize the Trump administration just like I would Obama and the Bush administration for not doing enough to empower the Iranian people. And I think one component of how to do this would be to lift or question many of the sanctions that we have in place on Iran, because my concern with tough sanctions on Iran is that we're going to fall into the same trap as we did in Iraq, where we resorted to sanctions and in doing so crippled and decimated the middle class in Iraq, which proved to be very problematic for after the regime fell and there was no civil society there left to really rebuild the country. So, I think whatever the merits were of his decision to stay or leave the Iran deal, the big point in my mind is that it happened in a larger context in which we weren't thinking the right way about the Iran challenge.
Isn't putting on crippling sanctions like we did Iraq, which we continue to do with Iran, isn't that an isolationist policy in itself?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, look, if we want to have very narrow sanctions geared toward cutting off the international bank accounts of this or that Iranian elite, fine. But when we're fundamentally just cutting off the Iranian economy and the Iranian people from the world, if we're basically stigmatizing the ability to do business with Iran, and in doing so creating all kinds of incentives for black markets and corruption, it doesn't make sense to me on a number of levels, and more than anything, it makes you question why our leaders are so afraid of the prospect of American goods and services going into Iran. To me, that seems like an opportunity rather than a problem.
And then when there's videos of like Brian Hook saying, he had that video out of the Iranian embassy, or the old Iranian embassy, saying how it's kept up with its old Persian rugs and whatnot. Like, does that type of behavior, and he's calling for the Iranian people to rise up and basically overthrow the government. Does that type of behavior, does that alienate us from the actual population that would facilitate any type of real change there?
Yeah, and the other thing that concerns me about comments like that is that it betrays and reveals what I think is fundamentally a lack of empathy and a lack of compassion that ought to guide any foreign policy move that we make. I think there's a tendency in our foreign policy to view sanctions as the kind of default thing that you do when you don't really know how to deal with a foreign policy problem. But when you think about the effect that it has for the people in these countries themselves, it's the difference between an Iranian family who has no culpability with what's happening in their country going from a level of sustenance and the middle class to being genuinely poor. And I think it's hard to really calculate the human cost of these sanctions. But the point is that I think it's fair to say that the average American policymaker is not giving that consideration its due. And I think that, again, it betrays just a lack of compassion and an understanding that our decisions that we make here in Washington have real, literally life or death consequences for people in other countries.
I think a lot of policymakers, they just assume that the sanctions are harming like the government and whoever the elites are. But I think you raise an excellent point that they fail to consider the hardships they place on the average civilian. Like, just think about the Iraq. I always think about the Iraq sanctions and how many people died, how many children died, just through lack of medical supplies and things like that. And it's tragic. And a lot of people in Washington are just not looking at that. They're not looking at that and how that could not only is that morally not right, but it also is counterproductive because it potentially makes the civilian population align with the hardliners, and it alienates us from the people who we would want to have natural change.
Yeah, and I would just add here, and I think this goes back to our earlier discussion about my evolution from realism, that, it's easy to say that, well, our policymakers ought to have more compassion, fine, but I think the question we have to ask is, why is it okay? Why do the American people believe it's okay? Why do our leaders believe it's okay to impose policies like sanctions or whatnot without all that much regard for the consequences of people in other countries? And I think that the answer, at least to me, I would be interested in your view, but my view on it is because we operate in a political universe where we take for granted certain nationalistic assumptions. We basically take for granted that our policymakers ought to be prizing or prioritizing the interests of the American people, and to do so in a way that is zero sum. But I'm hard pressed to see how we can get out of that mentality without fundamentally questioning the morality of a world order that's grounded around nation states, where we have these sort of units where politicians come to power believing that no matter how much power they have, military or economic or whatnot, that it's okay for them to make policy decisions on the basis of a couple million people in their arbitrary political entity without thinking about people in other countries as if they were their own responsibility. And I think until we begin to see national sovereignty weakening, markets being integrated, and a broader awareness that other people around the world are entitled to the same rights and prerogatives as we are, I think it's going to be very hard to get out of these traps that we set with our sanctions policy.
You know, I totally agree with you on that. At least on the part where you level some criticisms against the human costs of sanctions, and I'd add one piece of color to this that I think might help. At least the U.S., the American citizens understand its impacts, and that's, I think that a lot of the criticisms that you can levy against sanctions, is similar argumentation can be made against tariffs. And the convenient thing about tariffs is that we feel the impact. The United States citizens feel the impact. And so, if we turn our eye just quickly to, another example with China and the way that we are engaging in a trade war with China, our instincts, in these trade wars are very much like our instincts, in more aggressive tactics like against Iran, in that a tariff is like that default thing that you do when you don't really understand or not creative enough to think of something that would work to come to a mutual agreement, with trade deficits, for example. And so, we see Trump ever increasing tariffs, or at least threatening more tariffs. And the human cost, the assumption is that we are hurting the Chinese, but in fact we're simultaneously hurting ourselves, so whole industries, specifically agriculture, but many others are suffering and are in threat to suffer more due to these things. And I think to answer your question in a roundabout way, like how do we get out of the trap, of thinking that way? I think, empathy is about being able to relate to one another. And so if we are able to paint the picture that, sanctions, as an example, hurts people in the same way that tariffs hurt you, I think that might be a good bridge, to help the American people understand that, that there's real human costs to these types of decisions in foreign policy and, just domestically here.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I would add to that. One of the things that I find alarming about the Trump administration's resort to sanctions is that, to tariffs. Even though I'm a free trader, I think that tariffs have been used in different ways throughout American history. Sometimes it was used as a way to raise revenues for the state in lieu of taxes, which you can have a reasonable debate about. But one of the things that I think is different and concerning about the way the Trump administration has resorted to tariffs is that he's done so as part of a larger culture war, where he's made the argument for tariffs not simply as an instrument to get China to do this or that, but really it's grounded in a more populist narrative where tariffs are a good thing because they close our economy off to the world. They protect the American worker. They kind of keep out products or influence from other people in other country. Mm-hmm. And so while I definitely agree that it's worth pointing out the human cost of these tariffs, I think also the ideology and the philosophy and the assumptions that legitimate the use of tariffs needs to be attacked as well.
Absolutely, and we tried, and we've done a few episodes on tariffs in general, and neither of us are particularly good or favorable to them at all. And I definitely agree with you. I think that those myths need to be dispelled because, quite frankly, the ideology that tariffs are a good thing, for the American people is just, at best misguided, at worst just, ignorant. Ignorance of the realities, that is.
So we're over an hour. We don't want to keep you all night, but before we send this thing home, I would love to hear your take on, I guess there's two major things. Something that a reoccurring theme that we've been talking about over the past couple of weeks has been obviously Trump's claim that we're leaving Syria. And since then, there's been a lot of crazy stuff that's been going on. There seems to be a lot of flip-flopping to the point where, even someone like myself who's been following the Syrian war for some time is just kind of like, I don't really know what's going on right now. It seems like there's a lot of miscommunications that are going on. And to add that, yesterday we had Baghdadi, who was the commander of ISIS, allegedly killed. I don't the guy's been allegedly killed many times in the past couple of years, but this time it definitely seems like he has kicked the bucket, at least because there's been multiple countries who've been confirming his death. So, I'd love to hear your take on Trump's move to leave Syria, if you know anything about that. Or go back into Syria, whatever is going on right now, and maybe some insight on the whole Baghdadi thing, which the administration is very excited to announce.
Yeah, well, look, I think any commentary about or criticism or whatnot about Trump's policy on Syria, I think it's important to just keep in mind that at the end of the day in these conflicts, the reason why they're turning one way or the other is not fundamentally because of anything we do or don't do. I mean, to me, the biggest blunder that we've seen in the Syria conflict is really on the Syrian people themselves. I think the single biggest strategic mistake in this conflict was the decision by the Syrian opposition to Assad to turn a nonviolent uprising into a violent one, which I think is at the root of why this conflict spiraled into what it did. And I think had the Syrian And in fact, I actually met with someone from the Syrian Kurdish opposition, and we had this conversation that if they had maintained nonviolent discipline and tried to undermine the regime in different ways, that the conflict would have been turned out a lot better in any number of ways. And so, even if Trump's withdrawal from Syria does lead to problematic consequences and instability, and I think it will, I don't think it would be fair to pin the blame for what's happening in Syria fundamentally on Trump or the U.S.
Absolutely, and I think a big part of that blame has to do with the government, from the U.S. funding these rebels when things did get violent.
Yeah, it's astonishing to me that every time that we have a foreign policy conflict or we have an issue with a certain regime, I've never quite understood why it's the violent insurgents or the violent people in opposition who seem to command a certain degree of respect or deference in Washington compared to those who prefer nonviolent or political means to undermining these regimes. I mean, even when these regimes look to be strong, there are always people in exile. There are always people out there who are agitating in different ways, and I think that we could get a greater return on our dollar by supporting those who are working nonviolently rather than violently. I suppose that relates to the other question you posed about the Baghdadi assassination in particular. I mean, look, I'm obviously assuming that he's dead, and it looks like he is. I mean, this is obviously probably a positive development. But the idea that we're going to solve our problem with any adversarial movement by killing this leader or that leader, I think is totally misguided. And here I also think it's worth criticizing the Obama administration for the way they handled the killing of Osama bin Laden. I mean, certainly it was a strategic victory at some level for the U.S., but this conflict with radical Islam never should have been about bin Laden or even al-Qaeda. It should have really been about the question of how this mass movement throughout the Islamic world has come to the fore. Why are figures like Osama bin Laden emerging in the first place? And until we really figure out how to sort of drain the swamp of these ideologies, killing this leader or that leader is not going to get to the root of the problem.
I'd agree with that characterization. I think that, what we're doing is treating the symptoms and not necessarily curing the disease, by taking out this leader or that leader, as you say. And what I'd like to get a little bit more color from you from is specifically on Syria, is that, Trump's initial decision to pull out of Syria, didn't sit well with me for a number of reasons, but, it could be characterized as moving more towards, a pacifist movement. We're pulling out, right? We're not using aggression anymore. But, then we see these developments coming up whereby we're now diverting those U.S. forces from Syria to other areas in the Middle East, countries like Saudi Arabia, things like that, which is, it seems counter to the idea. And now very recently we are moving tanks and other armored vehicles back into Syria. So my criticism of Trump's foreign policy there in Syria is a lack of kind of cohesion, and almost like a lack of foresight. I thought that the operation to pull out of Syria, was morally necessary in a certain respect, but that it should have been taken out, undertaken in a way with consideration to the operational effect of it, and going back and putting more tanks in the country just seems like it threw away the risks and the dangers that they put a lot of the people in the region in. And I'm wondering, how does that square away with, your take on realism or beyond?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I think that the way the Syria withdrawal was handled was misguided on any number of levels. To me, there are two things that are particularly troubling about it. I think one is that, at least based on the reporting that I've seen so far, I actually don't really understand how this decision was even reached. I mean, from what I've gathered, there wasn't a normal interagency process. It seems like major senior figures in the administration were left in the dark. It looks to me like something happened between Trump and Erdogan, which we don't quite know yet, which led to this string of events. And so I think that there are serious questions here about the thought process, if any, behind what happened. But the other is the consequences for our relationship with the Kurds. And I think that if we're going to, at a practical matter, begin to withdraw U.S. forces from some of these areas and have a greater foreign policy of restraint, it's going to be very hard to do that without solid alliances and relationships between with countries or movements that are really at the front lines of these conflicts. I view the Kurds as being a very sympathetic group of people. I think they've developed a good working relationship with U.S. forces and civilians over the last decade. And of all the groups in the world to betray or get on the wrong foot with, I don't see why it has to be the Kurds.
I'd agree with that. Maybe, we're kind of running long here. I wanted to switch this up a little bit and just ask, I guess, a fun question, and then we can, wrap and you can plug some of your stuff. But let's talk about the 2020 Democratic hopefuls. I know we touched on it a little bit there, but what's your take here? Anyone standing out to you? Like, who do you think has the best opportunity to win the nomination at the very least?
Well, I think that probably it's going to be one of Biden, Warren, and Sanders. I mean, I've been struck by the extent to which the media is intent on basically writing off Biden and Sanders, but they're both very much in the hunt. My theory on this, which I can't totally prove, is that those who are in the elite media are predominantly not the kind of people who are sympathetic to Biden or Sanders, and whereas they do resonate in different ways with candidates like Warren and Buttigieg and Kamala Harris and others. So I think a lot of the picture we're getting from mainstream reporting is probably overstated. But I think that the big observation that I'm at least making is that whoever the Democratic nominee as that emerges, it's becoming abundantly clear to me from the way the debate is unfolding that there's a pretty profound shift that's happening in the Democratic Party on economics in particular. And I would argue that we now have two of the three main frontrunners who are, in one case, calling explicitly for socialism, and the other case, advocating for it without calling it that. And now even Biden, who I've always thought of as being a mainstream establishment Democrat, I mean, he's now staking out policies on economics that would have been considered quite extreme even 4 years ago. Right. So I think that we're, whoever the nominee is, I think we're going to have a fundamental debate about the legitimacy of a market-based capitalist economy going into the general election.
Do you think any of them have any chance of unseating Trump? That is, if he survives an impeachment?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it's an open question whether or not Trump will be the nominee, not only because of the impeachment scandal, but also the for reasons I don't completely understand, Republicans haven't really acknowledged or come to terms with just how badly Trump is polling. And if Trump's numbers continue to be where they are, or they even continue to dip a little bit more, and he does somehow get the Republican nomination, we could really see the kind of landslide election that we haven't had in a long time. So I think that if come March or April or something, if Trump's numbers continue to be where they are, he'll have to make his own decision on whether or not he wants to keep going or bow out of the race and deal with his legal issues and other things that he's dealing with. But I think that if Trump does in fact become the Republican nomination, I don't see any candidate on the Democratic side, maybe with the possible exception of Kamala Harris, who would not beat Trump in a general.
That's interesting.
Who would not beat Trump in a general?
In other words, I think all of them would beat Trump with the possible exception of Kamala Harris. Yeah.
Really? That's the first time. That's an interesting take, because a lot of the people I've been reading, I've been listening to have had the opposite take, that I haven't really looked at Trump's poll numbers, and I'll be completely honest. But a lot of the publications I've seen, and granted, they're definitely more right-leaning publications, have been saying that any Democrat that's been running is going to be beat in a landslide by Trump. So I feel like there's that's interesting, because I know that you're not a never Trumper. So I'm interested.
It means a lot more to you than me saying
Yeah, it means a lot more
to
me than if it was just an anti-Trumper saying that. Like Danny was saying that. Yeah.
Well, I've been struck, and I think this is true, ironically enough, of both Trump supporters and his critics, that they've, I think, had a tendency to severely overestimate Trump's popularity and his political prowess. I think there's very much this notion that Trump is a Teflon president or candidate, that he's not weakened by his blunders. It's simply not true. I mean, for one thing, if you look at his election victory in 2016, I would argue that this was a year after 8 years of Obama that in many ways structurally favored any generic Republican candidate. Add to that the fact that he was up against one of the most unpopular Democratic candidates. Add to the fact that how many lucky flukes, including the Comey announcement, broke in his favor, and despite all that, he barely eked it out by like a 10,000 vote margin or something.
What are you talking about? It was the biggest election ever. It was the biggest win ever.
No, that's right. And then when you look at Trump's approval ratings, he never crossed 50%, which if you situate that in the context of how good the economy has been, and you think about how high the approval ratings of any other recent president would have been, this is a very weak president, and it's going to be in an election that inevitably is going to be in large part a referendum on the incumbent. I'm hard-pressed to see, unless the Democrats really just screw it up somehow, how Trump's going to be able to build on the coalition that he had in 2016.
It's totally possible that they fuck it up.
Well, I think what's going on, and I'll just add one thing before we wrap this up. So I think what's going on with Trump is that I feel like I was at CPAC last year, and the direction that they were going in was uniting the conservative base in this grand battle of social versus socialism. And I think the hole that the Democrats have put themselves in, and you mentioned this before, even Joe Biden is spouting a lot of very left-wing economic policies. And I think they have a huge risk, no matter who the nominee is being seen as just radical leftist or so even socialist, which is, I think, is still a dirty word to a lot of people in the U.S. So I think that's a huge risk the Democrats are facing right now. And when it comes to voting for Trump, regardless of what the popularity is, versus voting for someone who could flip everything on his head and start implementing socialist policies, I think a lot of Americans might be very concerned about that. But then again, what do I know? During the last election, I would have bet $1 million that Trump would have lost. So I am in no position to make any type of predictions, or have been looking a lot at even the polling numbers with Trump. It's not something that we typically talk about that much on this podcast, to be completely honest.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting take from you, because you're not a leftist, so or not like I don't think that you're a Democrat, but it's an interesting take. It's an interesting take, I will say.
Yeah, well, look, I'll just say one more point here, and I say this regrettably, but if the Republican Party thinks that they can make this election a referendum on socialism, if they try to pigeonhole whatever Democratic candidate is in being a socialist, and that'll be enough to win, I think they're mistaken. And again, I say this regrettably, but if you look at the extent to which Americans are concerned about income inequality, you look at the tolerance that we now have of very high deficits, you look at the fact that there is virtually no major political party or candidate talking seriously about entitlement reform or rolling back significant government programs. I would argue in some ways we're already on the road to socialism. And if we in this moment really have a national referendum on whether or not the American people want more progressive taxation or less, whether they want more government or less, I fear that debate could very well break in a socialist direction. And in many ways, the things that have made the U.S. exceptional, our dedication to free markets and whatnot, there's nothing inevitable about that. And this could be the year where we begin to move toward a more European direction.
Well, you heard it here on Bro History. Pratik, thank you so much for taking your time out of your day to come and chat with us about way too many things. I want to give you an opportunity. Sorry, Henry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
I was just going to add, this has been great, and I appreciate you sticking with us for the full hour and a half.
No, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I guess you can find me on Twitter, or my website is simply my name, pratikchougule.com. I'm really grateful for the conversation, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, we need to have you on again. This has been great. We'll definitely keep track of your articles and let us know whenever you're releasing something and you want to
come on the show and talk about it. Yeah,
plug, because this has been great. Really, you brought some great perspectives, and just really enjoyed this conversation. I think everyone's going to get a lot out of it.
Great, thank you.
Hutchinson, Minnesota had some problems. For the adults of Hutchinson, the problem was the teenagers. They kept sneaking off at night to empty barns where they'd, brace yourself, dance. Who knew what sort of sin and heavy petting and French literature these barn dances might lead to? No, the adults of Hutchinson, Minnesota did not approve. And neither, it seemed, did the devil. One summer night, Satan himself suddenly appeared in the middle of the dance floor, and the debauched teens ran in fear. He showed up at the next dance, too. For a few months, it seemed like you couldn't go to a late-night barn dance in Hutchinson without getting chased out by the devil, pitchfork in tow. Until one night, when a 14-year-old boy had the good sense to shoot him in the chest. At which point the devil was revealed, Scooby-Doo style but bloodier, to be the local Methodist minister, dressed in a costume and flown in from the roof by rope and pulley. This is The Constant, a history of getting things wrong. I'm Mark Chrysler. Every episode, we look at the accidents, mistakes, and bad ideas that helped misshape our world. Find us at constantpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts.